The Not Very Nice Prince by Pamela Oldfield. Prince Ferdinand was not very nice, and hardly anybody liked him. Only the Princess Eglantine could put up with his rude manners, and they would visit each other from time to time for a game of snakes and ladders. One day the prince was driving home in the royal coach when it came to a sudden halt. An old woman was crossing the road with an ancient pram laden with firewood. The prince put his head out of the window and shouted at her, "I say, old woman, move that flipping pram out of my way and look sharp about it." The old woman looked at him. She was very ugly indeed and in need of a good wash. "Hang on a minute, your highness," she croaked. "This near side wheel's a bit wobbly." Now, a gentleman would have offered to help her, but Prince Ferdinand was no gentleman. "Don't bother me with your excuses," he shouted. "Get the flipping thing out of my way." Well, the ugly old woman was really a witch. She didn't like his manners and decided to teach him a lesson. She pointed at him with a long, bony finger and muttered some magic words. He heard the word flipping, but that was all. At once, the flipping thing flipped. To Ferdinand's dismay, the pram rose into the air and turned right over. All the firewood fell out onto the startled horses. They were very frightened and promptly ran away, and the coach came hitched and rolled into the hedge. The prince climbed out of his wrecked coach and looked for the old woman, but she had disappeared. He didn't know that she had put a spell on him. But the next day, a girl came to the door with a basket of eggs. "Good day to your highness," she said politely. "Will you buy some new-laid eggs?" "No, I won't," he said, without even a thank you. "But they're beautiful brown eggs," she said. "They may be sky blue pink for all I care," he said. "Take the flipping things away." You can guess what happened. The basket rose up into the air and turned over. The eggs fell on the prince's best velvet coat and ruined it. "Now I see it all," he cried fearfully. "The old woman was a witch and she's put a spell on me. I shall have to be very careful what I say from now on." The not very nice prince walked about all next day with his hand clapped over his mouth so that he wouldn't say anything foolish. But the next morning he forgot again. When the maid carried in his breakfast, he sat up in bed and scowled. "What on earth is that?" he asked. "Crunchy Pops, your highness." "Crunchy Pops," he grumbled. "I wanted eggs and bacon. Take the flipping things." Oh, too late, he realised what he'd said. The bowl of Crunchy Pops floated into the air and flipped right over. It emptied itself all over his head. Prince Ferdinand screamed with rage, and the terrified maid fled into a nearby broom cupboard and wept copiously. After that, things went from bad to worse. The prince became very flustered, and that made him even more forgetful. On Monday, he flipped a royal banquet. On Tuesday, it was a market stall. On Wednesday, it was a troop of the king's best soldiers. But he had finally gone too far. "Get out of my sight," roared the king, stamping his foot so hard that it hurt. "Don't come back until the spell is lifted." Notices were put up warning people to keep away from the prince, and they didn't need telling twice. So the unfortunate Ferdinand retired to a dark dungeon below the palace and wondered what he should do. He didn't tell anyone where he was, and no one bothered to find out, which was very sad. One day, the Princess Eglantine visited the king for a game of croquet. She had almost won the game when she caught sight of the prince watching them from the dungeon. Kindly, she offered to visit him for a game of snakes and ladders. "How can I concentrate on snakes and ladders at a time like this?" he wailed. "All I need is a flipping princess who—" He had done it again. Slowly, the princess rose into the air and turned over. She came down on her bottom and everyone laughed. The princess was mortified. "I shall be back when the spell is lifted, and not before," she told the king, and stomped off home with her nose in the air. The question was, who could lift the spell? The only visitor to the dark dungeon was an old woman who took him bread and water each day. Prince Ferdinand was so busy feeling sorry for himself he didn't even recognise her. He had plenty of time to ponder his manners and vowed that if the spell were ever lifted, he would be a reformed character. One day, the old woman, who was really the witch, came into the dungeon. She had a pail of water and a scrubbing brush, and she began to scrub the floor. The prince looked at her kindly. "That is hard work for an old woman," he said politely. "Please let me help you." To the old woman's dismay, he seized the scrubbing brush and fell to scrubbing the dungeon floor. She stared at him in horror. "You nincompoop," she roared, "you numbskull! Why do you have to be so polite? Your cursed good manners have lifted the spell and broken my power also. Oh!" And she vanished in a puff of horrid green smoke, which smelled like burnt kippers. Of course, the people were delighted. They carried Ferdinand through the streets rejoicing, all the way to the Princess Eglantine's palace. She was waiting eagerly for the very nice prince and another game of snakes and ladders.